produced by Susan Molly, Lord Zaguiar, Gavin Kashishan Mendez and Lauren Clark. 48 Hours, investigation of the Golden State Killer first aired on April 22, 2017. It was updated on April 28, 2018. The Golden State Killer was the most prolific serial predator in the nation. He attacked across the state from Sacramento down to Orange County across 15 jurisdictions, says investigator Paul Holes. His trail of violence terrorized Californians for decades. He was the boogeyman, says Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. He was the man in the bushes that we didn't know who he was and we didn't know when he was going to strike again. Investigators in California have spent decades searching for an elusive criminal who terrorized Californians by committing at least 120 burglaries, at least 50 rapes, and 12 murders. There was also one relentless amateur sleuth. Until her death in April 2016, true crime writer Michelle McNamara was obsessed with the case. Michelle was hot on the trail of the Golden State Killer. She was writing a book about him, says true crime journalist Billy Jensen. And she was a mom and a wife to a comedian, Patton Oswalt. She had such good insight, and I think it's because other investigators had trusted her. They told her things that weren't in some of the original files. She was tenacious about investigating the case, says Erica Hutchcraft of the Orange County DA's Sex Crimes Unit. She thought she was getting real close to finding him, says Jensen. 40 years without an arrest. Until now, we found the needle in the haystack, Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert announced to reporters on April 25. An arrest warrant was issued. This week, a 72-year-old former police officer, Joseph James Dungello, was arrested, suspected of being the elusive serial killer. Authorities identified Joseph James Dungello as the Golden State Killer suspect at a news conference April 25, 2018. I always thought he would be caught, always believed he was alive, survivor Jane Carson Sandler tells 48 Hours. I really had to question whether I was dreaming or not, Jensen says of the news of an arrest. This is insane, Patton Oswalt said in an Instagram video. Looks like they've caught the Golden State Killer, so, think you got him, Michelle. It's surreal, says Schubert. I think it's shocking to most of us that he was living amongst us. That's jaw-dropping. Citizen sleuth Patton Oswalt is a comedian and actor known to millions of fans. Yet he would tell you it was his wife, Michelle McNamara, who was the true star of the family, something Oswalt sensed as soon as they began dating. Patton Oswalt, I've met someone who is so much so above my punching class in terms of intelligence and wisdom and empathy. I was done for. She took a little bit of convincing. But convince her he did in 2005. Patton Oswalt, it was just like, oh, this is amazing. Tracy Smith, is that how you felt? Like you married up? Patton Oswalt, oh my god. Like basically having a false passport that gets me into, these amazing countries. That's the level that I married on with her. Oswalt learned his new bride had some unique interests. Patton Oswalt, Michelle was always a writer. She had published short stories and in poetry. And she was also always just fascinated with people, and just the messiness of life. Michelle was captivated by true crime stories, especially cold cases. Patton Oswalt, she had a mind for the details of true crime, the way that other people have for baseball or me for films. She could recall the details of pretty much every late 20th and 21st century crime. It was just in her head. In 2006, she started the blog True Crime Diary, where she profiled both recent and long-forgotten crimes. Patton Oswalt, when she started that blog and she realized, these two pursuits, they just haven't collided yet, and once they collided it wasn't a crash, it was a melding. And then it was, she was just off to the races. The pair welcomed daughter Alice in 2009. But even as motherhood took center stage, Michelle hunted for cases and clues. Patton Oswalt, once everyone was asleep, she was on that laptop. There is a breed of men and women that are just wired to pursue these people and keep going. When other people would have gone, oh, I gotta go live my life. Soon, Michelle's online quest brought her face to face with one of the worst villains she'd never heard of. Billy Jensen, when you hear Zodiac Killer, you know what it is. You hear Jack the Ripper, you know what it is. Billy Jensen is a true crime journalist in Southern California. Billy Jensen, you hear East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker, nobody knows what that is. The East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker, EARONS for short, not a very memorable name. One of the most prolific criminals California has ever seen, responsible for 50 rapes and 12 murders. And to this day, no one knows who he is. Patton Oswalt, when she started looking at the devastation that this guy wrought. You're taunting the police, you're taunting the population, and you're never caught. Michelle McNamara had found her nemesis. Paul Haynes. If one could be said to have a taste in crime, Michelle and my taste in crime were very similar. Paul Haynes is a researcher who worked with Michelle. Tracy Smith. Michelle called herself a citizen sleuth. What does that mean? Paul Haynes, a private citizen who's not in law enforcement and who's not a private investigator, that is drawn into a crime and does their own investigating based on, the tools that are available to them. Michelle started hitting the message boards of fellow online sleuths, hunting for everything she could learn about EARONS. Over one horrific decade he'd covered a lot of ground, starting as a rapist in the Sacramento area in 1976. Paul Haynes, his MO is basically break into a house in the middle of the night and confront a sleeping couple by shining a flashlight into the eyes of the female and insisting that she tie up the male. Then EARONS moved to Southern California, where he used the same MO to break in and rape. But now, he'd leave no witnesses. 12 people would be murdered before the serial rapist and killer stopped in 1986 and seemingly vanished. Paul Haynes, and she began working on a feature for Los Angeles Magazine. Michelle wrote an article about EARONS in 2013. She had details from bits of information she gleaned online and more explicit details from investigators on the case. The odd acronym EARONS was not a name many knew. So Michelle decided to rebrand him, hoping to give him a higher profile. Billy Jensen, working with her editor at Los Angeles Magazine, they said, with this Golden State Killer, it shows just the breadth of him having hit Northern California, Southern California, and then sort of right in the middle. With that, EARONS became the Golden State Killer. And Michelle would become a book author, signing a deal to write about him. But Michelle was no armchair detective, she wanted to see the places he terrorized up close. Patton Oswalt. The sun and the air look different in different places, and it changes how you perceive things. Oswalt says they sacrificed family time so Michelle could travel extensively by herself to retrace the steps of the killer. Patton Oswalt. It's one thing to read it on a piece of paper, but to actually walk it every day and see businesses and houses that were there, that are still there, changes the writing. So I would go out of my way to try to give that to her. Tracy Smith. So you were really the Watson to her Holmes? Patton Oswalt. Yeah, except Watson was way smarter than me, laughs. If I was the Watson to her Holmes, I was the kinda Watson that just went and got, coffee or, can you go get me a turkey burger please? Fine, I'll get a turkey burger. And even, I would get that order wrong. The obsession of hunting a serial killer took its toll on Michelle. Patton Oswalt. I'd go back in the back office, and Michelle would just be there, just in tears because some road she had gone down had not panned out, and then, it's like, I now have to start back again from zero, and she did, picking up news promising leads in her hunt for the Golden State Killer. By April 2016, Michelle had been driving herself hard, hoping for a breakthrough. On the night of the 20th, she was exhausted from it all. Patton Oswalt. I just remember this so clearly, saying, tomorrow just sleep till you wake up the next day. Around mid-morning, Oswalt checked on Michelle. Patton Oswalt. She was snoring. Remember I was laughing, oh, she's snoring, and then I brought her. I went and got her an Americana, left it on her bedside. By early afternoon, when Michelle still hadn't gotten up, Oswalt went to check on her again. Patton Oswalt. She was dead. And I tried reviving her and it was just, And then everything after that to me is, I remember it as, screaming, and vomiting, and EMT guys, and friends. Michelle McNamara had died at the age of 46. Patton Oswalt. It was April 21st, spring's coming, it's all good, and then literally within the space of 3 hours, just annihilation. This world that you're seeing in front of you is just, in cinders. It's just cinders. The rapist's Moffin Michelle McNamara died so suddenly, her husband, Patton Oswalt, and 7-year-old daughter Alice were devastated. Patton Oswalt. I want to talk to her so badly. I miss her so much. And I'm just sad all the time. Patton Oswalt talks about grief 102 days after wife's death, so when he won an Emmy for writing a variety special just 5 months later, the moment was bittersweet. Patton Oswalt to reporters backstage at the Emmys. I'm not trying to say this is meaningless, but it really does. Everything seems like the lights have been turned down 50% on everything since she's gone. Oswalt was still waiting for the L.A. County Coroner's Office to find the cause of Michelle's death, but he'd reached an important decision. Patton Oswalt. Her book needed to be finished. It had so consumed her life and it was so much a part of her. Larry Crompton, I thought she was one of the nicest people I had ever had the opportunity to meet. Larry Crompton spent decades with the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Department. Michelle met with him in the hope of tapping into his wealth of knowledge about the monster she was chasing. Larry Crompton, he would walk through the area just like a normal person, so nobody would notice him. Crompton tells the story of a white man of average height and slim athletic build, in his early 20s, who stalked his victims before striking, though they never knew it. Larry Crompton would go in the house when the people weren't there and set that house up. And he would leave a window unlocked or a door unlocked so that he could go in. Michelle learned the rapist would also hide tools for his attack. Larry Crompton, one thing that the rapist would do is leave shoelaces or whatever to tie people up with. When the rapist returned to attack, he'd come armed with a knife or gun, wearing a ski mask and gloves. Tracy Smith, no fingerprints. Larry Crompton, no fingerprints. He would blindfold the victims. And, after tying them, he would take a towel and tear it up and use that for a blindfold. A few sketches were released based on brief glimpses by eyewitnesses. Within a year, the rapist crisscrossed Northern California, striking 22 times. A few sketches were released based on brief glimpses by eyewitnesses on the street as he got away every time. That knack for avoiding capture haunted Michelle. Anne Marie Schubert, he struck so often, he hit so many times, it was so frequent. Today Anne Marie Schubert is the district attorney of Sacramento County. But back in 1976, she was just a local 12-year-old. Anne Marie Schubert, I have very vivid memories of what he did to this community. Because it was so significant. It really changed Sacramento County. It was a national story covered by CBS News. CBS News report, each night they patrol the neighborhoods of Sacramento County's east side. They call themselves the EARS Patrol. EARS, short for East Area Rapist Surveillance. Paul Holes is a cold case investigator with a DA's office in Larry Crompton's old county. Paul Holes, you have people who are scared. This was a community where they wouldn't lock their doors. And now they're having locksmiths come out to install deadbolts. People were going and buying guns. Michelle had flown to meet Holes, as well. Paul Holes, that first day, we spent probably 6 hours in the car, between, in the car and getting out and looking at the various scenes that I took her to. To catch him, Michelle had to understand him. For the Golden State Killer it seemed to be about the notoriety. Anne Marie Schubert, he had complete control over this community. And he thrived off that. He thrived off the media attention. In fact, he took cues from the press. Initially, he'd only attacked women who were alone. But then, Larry Crompton, the newspaper mentioned that he had never hit a place with a man in the house. Tracy Smith, and that Larry Crompton, he read that Tracy Smith was a challenge to him. Larry Crompton, that was a challenge. And that's when he started with the men. Immediately, the rapist started targeting couples. And he adjusted his mo as he went. After waking the pair, he'd insist the female tie up the male. Paul Haynes, then he would bind the female, and then reinforce the bindings on the male. He'd lull the couple into thinking he was just there to rob them. Paul Haynes, he would ask the victims where the money was, where the female's purse was. He would ask the female to accompany him, to show him where it was. As soon as the couple was separated, the rapist would set his true, and terrifying, plan in motion. Paul Haynes, he would retie the female, in the living room of the house. He would return to the male, and stack dishes on the male's back. And he would tell the male, if you move, I'll hear these dishes rattle, and I'll kill everything in the house. Immobilized and emasculated, the man was then forced to lie there, listening to the rape occurring a room away. Larry Crompton, how a man can deal with that, knowing that he could be the reason for his family to die, and then in his mind, no, but I can't do anything. I have to shut up. I can't save anybody. For him to live with that, very, very, very difficult. The rapist toyed with his victims, often breaking off mid-attack and wandering into the kitchen. Billy Jensen, he would go in, he would eat food in the house. He would take things that weren't necessarily worth a lot, but they would be worth something to the individuals. When it was over, the rapist slipped out silently, leaving his victims bound and blindfolded, afraid to move for hours. One victim remembers all too well. Jane Carson Sandler, what is he gonna murder us? Is he gonna kill us? What's he gonna do to us? State of fear. The identity of the Golden State Killer is a mystery that kept true crime writer and amateur detective Michelle McNamara up all night. I don't think this guy was a homeless drifter type. I think he was probably a tradesman, something like that. Michelle McNamara. Patton Oswalt says what drove his wife was the pain the attacker had inflicted on his victims. Patton Oswalt, you know, she was filled with angst for the survivors, for the families. Michelle had spoken to many victims, women like Jane Carson Sandler. She was the rapist's fifth victim. Jane Carson Sandler, you're always looking over your left shoulder. Always. Jane's horrifying ordeal began shortly before dawn in October 1976. Her husband had just left for work, leaving Jane, then a student nurse and Air Force Reserve captain, in their bed. Jane Carson Sandler, my son came and he was 3 years old. He came and got in bed with me to snuggle. And, right after that I heard the garage door close. So, I knew my husband was gone. And within 3 minutes, I heard someone running down the hall. And they had a flashlight in their hand. A man wearing a ski mask and black leather gloves burst into her room holding a large butcher knife. Tracy Smith, what was going through your head? Jane Carson Sandler, what's he doing? Hopefully, he's just going to rob us and leave. So I said, take our money. Take whatever you want, and the minute I started to say something, he would say, in his clenched teeth, shut up or I will kill you. He then proceeded to take shoelaces and tie our hands, our wrists and our ankles. And then he gagged us and blindfolded us, both of us. Just fear, fear. Michelle McNamara had spoken to many victims, including Jane Carson Sandler, who became the rapist's fifth victim in October 1976. Standing in front of me was this man with a ski mask on, holding a large butcher knife. It was sheer terror, frozen in fear kind of feeling. When the intruder untied her ankles, Jane realized he was going to rape her. But Jane was focused on something else. Jane Carson Sandler, when I went to lean next to my 3-year-old son, he was gone. He was gone. So when the rape took place, I wasn't paying any attention to it. Because all I was thinking about is, where's my son? After the rape, the attacker kept going in and out of her bedroom. Jane Carson Sandler, and at one point, I leaned again and my son was back next to me. So he put him back. And that was such a relief. Because I knew he was alive. But the rapist wasn't gone. Jane could hear him in the kitchen rattling pots and pans. Jane Carson Sandler, and then he would come back in the bedroom and say, don't you make a move or I'll come back in here and kill you. Finally, after what seemed to Jane like an eternity, there was silence. Jane Carson Sandler, I was still afraid to move. But it was getting light outside. And I thought, we've got to get out of here, so hobbled around the backyard, to the gate in the front of the house, and then just screamed for a neighbor. Jane and her son survived, but the carefree life her family had known did not. Jane Carson Sandler, I was afraid. Is he gonna come back? Is he still stalking me? You know, does he live down the street? Tracy Smith, did you ever think that it would happen to you? Margaret Wardlow, never ever. My mom always said she's too old. I was too young. We wouldn't be victims. But the rapist would prove them wrong. In November 1977, 12-year-old Margaret Wardlow would become the rapist's 27th and youngest victim. Margaret Wardlow, I woke up to this flashlight in my face. I saw him in a mask. I had my hands tied behind my back. He tied them extremely tight. The attacker left Margaret's room, but she soon heard him upstairs in their kitchen. Margaret knew from newspaper accounts that the rapist would use plates as an alarm system, placing them on the backs of household members that were not his intended target. In November 1977, Margaret Wardlow, at age 12, would become the rapist's 27th and youngest victim. Margaret Wardlow, I knew if he came into my room, he was gonna rape my mom. And if he went into my mom's room, he was gonna rape me. And he went into my mom's room. The intruder raped Margaret, but in her youthful defiance she refused to give him what she thought he really wanted. Tracy Smith, you didn't want to show him you were scared. Margaret Wardlow, I didn't want to show him I was scared. I knew he got off on scaring people and having the control of fear. In fact, the rapist would often call his victims after the attack. Investigators recorded one of his bone-chilling phone calls. Phone call recording, gonna kill you. Gonna kill you. F***ing whore. District Attorney Anne-Marie Schubert says he also relished tormenting investigators. Anne-Marie Schubert, it was the thrill, and the excitement of taunting them. Tracy Smith, and I still have the power. Anne-Marie Schubert, and I still have the power. And you haven't caught me. In 1977, investigators held a series of town hall meetings. Larry Crompton, and in one of those meetings, a man stood up and said that, if he ever comes to my house, I'll kill him, that he would protect his wife, protect his family. Just months later, that man and his wife were attacked. The rapist was probably at the meeting disguised as just another concerned citizen. Desperate to capture him, investigators literally chased down thousands of leads. Larry Crompton went through the names of 6,000 paroled rapists. Tracy Smith, did you feel like you were constantly going down rabbit holes? Larry Crompton, oh, yes, there were names that would come up that really looked good. And you would work 'em and work 'em and work 'em. And nothing, but the assailant did leave some intriguing clues. Investigator Paul Holes says 3 sheets of notebook paper may hold the key. Paul Holes, with Tracy Smith outside, the homework evidence was found somewhere generally along in this area. Tracy Smith, just lying on the ground somewhere around here. Paul Holes, lying on the ground. Holes believes the suspect dropped the papers as he fled from a rape scene in 1978. One of the sheets appeared to be a homework assignment on General Custer. Another page is full of angry rants about an unnamed teacher. But it's the hand-drawn map that interests Holes the most. Paul Holes, and the million-dollar question is, what was the purpose of that diagram, Tracy Smith? And your answer is, Paul Holes, that diagram is a brainstorming session of somebody trying to figure out how to lay out a parcel of land. So this tells me, this is somebody that has an association with the development, building or real estate industry. The hand-drawn map investigators believe was dropped by the suspect, and Michelle McNamara shared Holes' enthusiasm about the map. Tracy Smith, you and Michelle both thought this diagram is key. Paul Holes, so Michelle and I talked about the diagram a lot. She understood the importance of the diagram. Whoever he was, the rapes in Northern California stopped shortly after he dropped that note. The attacker disappeared, but the nightmare was about to begin for Southern California. A killing spree. I definitely think that there's something about the housing thing that seems interesting. There seemed to be a lot of new houses around where he hid and a lot of houses for sale. Michelle McNamara. In July 1981, a realtor walked into a home in Santa Barbara County and made a grisly discovery. Inside were the bodies of Cheri Domingo and her boyfriend, Greg Sanchez. Cheri had been bound and bludgeoned. Greg Sanchez had been shot and beaten. The 1981 murders of Cheri Domingo and Greg Sanchez were the latest in a string of unsolved cases across Southern California. Debbie Domingo, I've always had this image in my head of what her last moments were like. The fear, the absolute terror that she had to have been going through. Debbie Domingo, Cheri's daughter, was only 15 at the time. To this day she lives with that painful image and with regrets. Debbie Domingo, and the last thing I said to her was, why don't you just stay out of my life? And I carried a lot of guilt for a long time because of the last things that I said to her. Domingo says their relationship had been turbulent in the weeks before the murders. Debbie Domingo, she and I were fighting just like you wouldn't believe. She was doing her best to be a good mom. She had never really dealt with a headstrong teenager. And Tracy Smith, and you were a headstrong teenager. Debbie Domingo, I was pushing the envelope pretty bad. When her mom tried to lay down some house rules, Domingo decided to run away. She'd been gone for about 3 weeks when she got a call from a neighbor. Debbie Domingo, and she said, you need to come home. Tracy Smith, what were you told at the time about what happened to your mom and Greg? Debbie Domingo, the best answer I ever got was, someone broke into the house and killed them. I resigned myself to never ever knowing what really happened. Debbie Domingo had no way of knowing that her mother and Greg's murders were the latest in a string of unsolved murders across Southern California. Over the span of a year and a half, 3 other couples and a woman were killed in their homes, all in a strikingly similar brutal fashion. In December 1979, Dr. Robert Offerman and his girlfriend, Deborah Manning, had been murdered in Goleta. In March 1980, Lyman and Charlene Smith had been found dead in Ventura. 5 months later, Keith and Patrice Harrington had been killed in Dana Point. And in February 1981, Manuela Whithun was found bludgeoned to death in Irvine. Tracy Smith, so, you had a hunch that the Southern California homicides were related to the East Area rapist. Larry Crompton, yes. When Larry Crompton, who'd investigated the rapes up north, first heard about the murders, he knew almost immediately it was the same suspect. Larry Crompton, I had no proof. But we looked at the reports and said, it is the same. The victims were treated the same way, and tied up the same way. Crompton had always suspected the rapist would escalate to murder. Larry Crompton, we knew that he wanted to kill. But all he needed was the justification. That came after 2 couples in a row managed to escape during an attack. The assailant would never let that happen again. Larry Crompton, the next time he murdered, and that's what he did after that. Even though he was sure that Southern California was now under attack by the same suspect, Crompton couldn't convince the different jurisdictions that their murders were all connected. Larry Crompton: one of the problems we had back then is that law enforcement agencies did not work together, and very little information went from one to the other. Michelle McNamara believed the suspect used this to his advantage, moving from county to county, killing without mercy. This was a crazed, horrible psychopath. He was obviously very, very angry. Michelle McNamara's killer seemed to take a 5-year hiatus after 1981. But in May 1986, he resurfaced again in Irvine, at another house that was for sale. Michelle Cruz. Everybody always wants to know why. Why Janelle? Michelle Cruz's sister, 18-year-old Janelle Cruz, was the killer's youngest and last known murder victim. Michelle Cruz: I got a phone call, and it was one of my girlfriends. And she said, your sister was murdered. In May 1986, Janelle Cruz became the killer's youngest and last known victim. Michelle learned that Janelle had asked a male friend to keep her company that night. Michelle Cruz: maybe she was scared because she felt like maybe somebody was watching her. Tracy Smith: and he said that they heard noises. Michelle Cruz: they heard noises. She said, well, maybe it's just a cat outside. And they went back to talking, before he ended up having to leave and go home for the night. Larry Montgomery: that noise that she heard that night was probably accurate. He probably was in the side yard. Larry Montgomery was the lead investigator on Janelle's case back in 1986. Tracy Smith: what state was she in? Larry Montgomery: she had been bludgeoned badly on the face. She was on her back, in a position that looked like it's possible she had been tied up. It looked like she'd been sexually assaulted. Montgomery's investigation into the murder was intense. Still, it went nowhere. But in 1996, the advent of DNA technology provided a break in the cold case. Larry Montgomery: they were able to find DNA, and discovered that the DNA from Janelle Cruz's case matches the DNA in the Whithun case 5 years earlier, and then they started getting hits on other DNA in Ventura County, Santa Barbara County. A year later, investigator Paul Hole's testing on the Northern California rape kits connected the rapes to each other. But the most important forensic discovery came in 2001, when the murders were finally connected to the rapes, officially confirming what Larry Crompton had long suspected. Tracy Smith: what was it like for you to get that confirmation that your hunch was right? Larry Crompton: it settled a lot in my mind. And I really had a feeling that, yes, now they're going to catch him. Today there is a concerted effort among all the jurisdictions to bring the violent rapist and killer to justice. Erica Hutchcraft from the Orange County DA's Sex Crimes Unit has been working on the case for over a decade. Erica Hutchcraft: I thought when I first looked into the cases that it was like something you would study in a criminology course. And it was horrifying, but at the same time, you think, oh, I can make a difference, and contribute to the solving of the case. Hutchcraft found a kindred spirit in Michelle McNamara. Michelle had reached out to Erica, and the working mom soon bonded, trading information and debating ideas. Erica Hutchcraft: it was nice to be able to talk to someone who knew as much about the case, and that she could talk the case with me and rattle off things. One of the biggest questions surrounding the case has always been, why did the murder stop after Janelle Cruz was killed? Michelle had a theory: people slow down in life. You don't have that sort of energy. I mean, it's biological and emotional. You can't be out at 3 a.m. running across roofs because you're not 18 anymore. Michelle McNamara: but Hutchcraft is not so sure. Tracy Smith: there could be other victims, after Janelle Cruz. Erica Hutchcraft: there could be other victims after Janelle Cruz if they didn't get DNA evidence and upload it to the system. That's what I am fearful of. And I do go down that avenue still. We go and talk to groups of investigators still, and we say, where's your cold case team? Do you have evidence that can be tested in any of your old cases? And Hutchcraft's been consumed by this case, just like Michelle was. Erica Hutchcraft: I have never been the same since I started working these cases. It's like an obsession. You know, so it's overwhelming at times, but it does change your life. And this case has even changed the law in California. Since 2009, largely due to the efforts of Bruce Harrington, the brother of one of the murder victims, all adults arrested or charged with a felony in California must submit a DNA sample for inclusion in the state database. But even though California currently maintains the third largest DNA database in the world, so far they have had no hits that match the killer. He has somehow even managed to elude technology. Debbie Domingo: I believe he can be found. I believe that it's time for his reign of terror to end. The final chapter. The great tragedy of this case to me is that it's not better known, and frankly it should be solved. I mean, it just should be. Michelle McNamara. In June 2016, 2 months after Michelle McNamara's death, the FBI used the 40th anniversary of the Golden State Killer's first attack to announce a renewed investigation and a $50,000 reward. In 2016, the FBI released sketches made by 3 witnesses in a renewed attempt to catch the Golden State Killer. California. Anyone with information on the case is urged to call the FBI's tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI or go to tips.fbi.gov. FBI press conference. Today, we're going to launch a national campaign to help identify the East Area rapist, Golden State Killer, Larry Crompton. When the FBI finally got involved, that opened it up. They were getting hundreds of calls a day with names. A lot of them were nothing. But it only takes one. Jane Carson Sandler. All of this attention now is being placed on this case. Tracy Smith. Isn't there a piece of you that says, it's been 40 years, Jane Carson Sandler? Oh, yes. Why now? Right, why now? But I'm glad now. And, an official list now includes 2 early homicides attributed to the Golden State Killer. Paul Haynes. They were walking their dog when somebody confronted them and pursued them into a backyard. It is now believed that the Golden State Killer committed his first murder in 1978, shooting Katie and Brian Maggiore outside their home near Sacramento. In 1978, Brian and Katie Maggiore were living just outside of Sacramento when they were shot near their home. Though seemingly not premeditated, they're now believed to be his first murder victims. Paul Haynes. So the question is, was it somebody that Brian Maggiore knew and recognized, and saw peeping in a window and confronted? Investigators believe there could be others who recognize him, and his distinctive path through California, but time is running out. Erica Hutchcraft. All the witnesses, all the original investigators, everybody's going to start passing away. It's now or never. They also still believe the DNA profile will find a match. Anne-Marie Schubert. There is nothing that you can do to change your DNA. It is the greatest tool of identification we've ever had. Thank God they have his DNA. Michelle McNamara. Just as Michelle had tracked down every possible lead, Paul Holes, once she earned my trust, she literally became my investigative partner. Authorities today are pursuing the hundreds of new tips. Anne-Marie Schubert. It's a needle in a haystack, but the needle's in there somewhere. And it's our job to find it. Paul Holes, he's one step ahead. And it's not to try to put any type of glamour on the guy. But I truly appreciate the offender that I'm chasing. I think even within the last few months, we've notched closer to him. Erica Hutchcraft. We're all so dedicated and we work so much on this case and it becomes your life. Sorry. Cries. Tracy Smith. That's okay. ... Why do you think it gets to you? Erica Hutchcraft. 'Cause I care. You know, I care. I don't wanna ever stop caring. If you stop caring, then what good are you as a detective or a cop or a human being? Michelle McNamara was fueled by that same caring. Whether or not the Golden State Killer is still alive, his victims deserve justice. Patton Oswalt. There are survivors, there are victims of the Golden State Killer alive who wake up every day going, that guy is walking around free. That's what Michelle thought about all the time, were those people. 9 months after Michelle McNamara passed away, the Los Angeles County coroner released the cause of her death, a combination of powerful prescription drugs, along with an undiagnosed heart condition. Michelle McNamara's work could well be the key to finally identifying the Golden State Killer. Patton Oswalt. Once she had passed, everything in me was dead, except that was the one spark of, life force left in me, of a moving forward life force. Is finish her book. Oswalt says there's no way he could finish writing Michelle's book by himself. So he entrusted Jensen and Haynes to bring it across the finish line. Her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was released in February 2018. Michelle McNamara. Video. I'm optimistic. I know that it sounds crazy to be optimistic. But I am. Tracy Smith. In your gut, do you think he'll be caught? Patton Oswalt. In my gut, I think he is gonna be caught. Because of what Michelle did and because of what all the cops did before her, I hope. Those are the 2 words I say way too much these days. I hope. Incredibly, just this week, almost 2 years to the day of Michelle's death, there was stunning news from Sacramento. Anne-Marie Schubert. Addressing reporters, the answer has always been in Sacramento. For over 40 years, countless victims have waited for justice. Joseph James Dongello, 72, a former police officer, is suspected of being an elusive serial killer who investigators say committed at least 12 homicides, 50 rapes and dozens of burglaries across California in the 1970s and 1980s. At right, Dongello is a member of the Auburn Police Department, where he worked from 1976 to 1979 before being fired. Joseph James Dongello, 72, a cop in the 1970s, was arrested at his home. He had been fired from the police force in 1979 after he was accused of shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a drugstore. He is separated from his wife, a lawyer, and has 3 adult daughters. Anne-Marie Schubert, his name was never on any lists that I'm aware of. But new technology may have been the downfall of the suspected killer. Investigator Paul Holes says they plugged the genetic profile of the Golden State Killer into the genealogical website gedmatch.com and they got a link to genetic material stored there by one of DeAngelo's relatives. Gedmatch.com is an open-source site that requires no subpoena. Paul Holes, we are dealing with distant relatives and we are literally having to follow trees. Find individuals within that pool of people that fit the criteria we know about the offender. Roughly his age, geographic locations, physical aspects. After painstaking work, they finally landed on D'Angelo as a good suspect, but they still needed his DNA to make a positive match. All this was happening as Paul Holes was retiring 3 weeks ago. Paul Holes, my last day of active duty, the day I handed in my gun and badge, I was sitting in front of his house. And I thought maybe I should knock on the door. I'll just talk to him and see if he'll give me a DNA sample, and I backed off. I said I don't know enough about him yet and I need to look more. Authorities say they made that positive match last week after collecting a sample of DeAngelo's DNA from something he had discarded in a public location. Paul Holes, at that point, we knew we had our man. It's a bittersweet thing for me because I was that close. I was 50 feet away from the guy I've been looking for years and I didn't close the deal, but when you look at who he is and the danger of that, and I was alone, probably thank God, I did drive away. As it turns out, D'Angelo was in their midst all along, living in Citrus Heights, the same city where Jane Carson Sandler was attacked in the 1970s. Jane Carson Sandler, I'm so glad it's over. I mean, it's such a relief after all this time. He's behind bars, and he needs to pay for his crimes. He's just destroyed so many families. Margaret Wardlow was the Golden State Killer's youngest victim. Margaret Wardlow, I was just so happy I haven't been able to wipe the smile off my face. I called Debbie Domingo and she just couldn't believe it. Debbie Domingo, she was the first voice that told me that they got him. Now Debbie Domingo can finally put a face to her mother's accused murderer. Debbie Domingo, you thought you were so smart, but you were wrong. You are not getting away with this. Anne-Marie Schubert to reporters, we found our needle in the haystack. It was the ending for the victims Michelle McNamara always wanted. Ironically, Billy Jensen was in McNamara's hometown of Chicago, along with Patton Oswalt promoting her book when he got the news. Billy Jensen, it was shock and quite frankly I had to question whether I was dreaming or not. It was getting more real and then being able to tell Patton, that was special. Her death really gave so much life to this case. No one talked about the case until she wrote the article. Oswalt echoed that sentiment later that day on late-night television. Patton Oswalt on Late Night with Seth Meyers, her book and the article that led to the book really amped up the investigation in the case. In court on Friday, April 27, the suspected Golden State Killer, who terrorized a state for decades, appeared in a wheelchair. He was arraigned on 2 counts of murder in Sacramento County. He did not enter a plea. Joseph James D'Angelo, the suspected Golden State Killer, appears in court for his arraignment on April 27, 2018 in Sacramento, California. He is also charged with 2 murders in Ventura County and 4 in Orange County. More charges are expected. Police say he is on suicide watch. Although Michelle McNamara wasn't around to see the capture of the suspected Golden State Killer, she imagined how it would happen in her epilogue titled, Letter to an Old Man. Billy Jensen, reading epilogue, one day soon you'll hear a car pull up to your curb, an engine cut out. You'll hear footsteps coming up your front walk. No side gates are left open. You're long past leaping over a fence. This is how it ends for you. Open the door. Show us your face. Walk into the light.